My name is Max Easterman, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to the Goethe-Institute's latest pair of Doppelgänger. It's a great way for you to learn about the way Britons and Germans live and work today. Each time we interview two people from the same profession in each country. Someone in the UK who's worked in Germany, and someone from Germany who's worked in this country in the same job. Our Doppelgänger focus this time is on historians. Historians are in the limelight at the moment because 2014 is a year of great anniversaries. 75 years since the outbreak of the Second World War, 25 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and exactly 300 years since the Hanoverians came to the throne, since when the British monarchy has been, well, yes, German. The German name was changed to Windsor in 1917 during the First World War, and 2014 is also the centenary of the outbreak of that conflict. We've had a whole raft of new books on the First World War, new analysis, new perspective. But the war has turned the spotlight back on the historians and the fact that they have never been able to achieve, and still can't achieve, consensus on how and why the war broke out. Sir Hew Strachan is Professor of the History of War at All Souls College, Oxford. He was born in Edinburgh and educated at the University of Cambridge, where he's still a Fellow of Corpus Christi College. He's been a merchant seaman and a lecturer at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. He's the author of the Oxford Illustrated History of the First World War and has written about Clausewitz and German strategy in the First World War, so he knows both sides of that coin. He's also on the World War I Centenary Advisory Board. So Hew, I'd like to begin, if I may, by asking you about being a historian of Germany. What's the fascination for you of Germany?
Well, I'm a military historian, sadly, for Germany, particularly given where Germany stands today and its position in relation to war is pretty important in understanding Germany. It's also important to the understanding of war. It's very hard, I think, to be an adequate military historian, at least in a European context, without engaging with Germany. It's so important for 19th and 20th century military thought, so important in terms of being seen as the leading military power, and therefore, other countries emulate it. So I don't really think you can get inside modern military history without engaging with Germany.
Clausewitz effectively wrote the ur-text on military strategy. Is what he wrote back in the 19th century as relevant now as it was then?
Yes, it's one of his I think, immense strengths. I mean, the more I read Clausewitz, the more I admire the man. I don't think he's a very likable man, but that's, his wife loved him dearly. But he is utterly focused on a debate. And when I'm being flippant, which is quite frequently, I will tend to say, if he was still alive, he'd still be writing that book, because the book is a constant debate with the evidence that he finds. That every time he came up against a problem, he would use military history. He would go back and he'd dig around and say, how does reading military history help us understand what this particular problem in strategy is? And it's precisely that debate and the reluctance to come to conclusions, although he did want to come to conclusions, but it's that reluctance to come to a premature or a flip conclusion which makes him so profound.
Is there a reluctance amongst historians today to draw lessons from history, such as from the events of the First World War?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, lessons are not something historians do, because we would all argue that what happens in a particular period is particular to that period. It's not reproducible. History doesn't mean history doesn't have a didactic value. What history does, I think, is generate understanding, which is a different thing. It also, I think, has, particularly in less literate societies than Britain and Germany, has an immediacy that, in a funny old way, we've lost contact with. I think the printed word has created a distance. We almost create too much distance from the past to our present, so it's that sense of context which I think is also important. I mean, who are we? Well, history is quite important in answering that question. It's a different question from, are there lessons to be learned?
Isn't the First World War just a classic example of how historians cannot reach consensus? I'm thinking of the revisionists and anti-revisionists in the 1920s, for example.
That is absolutely true, and that is, of course, one of its fascinations. It's also why the war is a great didactic tool in its own right, because controversy is very good for educational purposes. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we should be pleased about the attention to the centenary as historians, because the controversies will provide an educational tool. You know, by the 1930s, the argument about German war guilt had, broadly speaking, been put to bed in most quarters. Most people did accept the version that Europe had slithered over the brink into the boiling cauldron of war, as Lloyd George said. That view held until Fritz Fischer published his books in 1961. Even in 1962, you know, for most English-speaking historians, and certainly somebody like John F. Kennedy in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, Europe had still slithered over the brink into the boiling cauldron of war. Fischer gradually gained ground. German war guilt was therefore re-established as a form of consensus. And now we're back again to the 1930s position. You know, even if you are a diehard defender of the argument that Germany is responsible for causing this war, that in itself is insufficient to explain the war's outbreak.
Here in Britain, we tend to reflect on the First World War through Remembrance Day, the 11th hour, the 11th day, the 11th month. Now, you've written that 2014 must not be Remembrance Day writ large. What did you mean by that?
Because the day on which we commemorate the dead of all wars since 1914 is the day on which, for Britain, the First World War ended, or at least the war with Germany ended. Let's be clear, the whole war doesn't end on the 11th of November 1918. Because we do all that, we have continued to carry the First World War in our remembrance baggage ever since that war. It is therefore very easy when we get to the anniversary of that war to make those symbols the continuing way in which we commemorate it. And that does all sorts of confusing things to us, because Remembrance Sunday is not just about the First World War now. It's a funny old mixture of sort of patriotic sentiment, respect for the dead of the war, believing that these were good wars, because we don't have Germany's problem in confronting our past, or we have elected not to confront our past on this, and believing that we should be sorry for all the dead in all wars. We haven't quite decided whose side we're on in this on Remembrance Sunday. So it can carry all that baggage. Now that seems to me gets quite a long way from the First World War specifically itself. And furthermore, if we use that as the sort of dominant motif for a 4-year commemoration, then we are simply going to become very bored. So I think it has to be about more than that. And particularly for 2014, it has to be about more than that, because when the war broke out, although people were shocked, surprised, apprehensive, uncertain, they had no idea what was going to happen to them. And if we use Remembrance Sunday as the vehicle by which we approach the commemoration of the outbreak of the war, then we won't be anywhere near where they were when they went off to war.
The Germans confront their history. They call it Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Why is it the Germans have done this and we have not?
Well, there is a very straightforward answer to that, and it is the Third Reich. It is the question of whether there is collective German responsibility for the Nazis and for the Holocaust. That there is a continuous narrative that really begins with Frederick the Great's Prussia, that sees the army as central and the use of military power as central to the assertion of Prussia as a central European state. And after all, it is essentially surrounded by land frontiers and by possible enemies. The army has to be central to the formation of the state. And it is through war that Germany is both unified in 1871 and through war that Germany expands in the 20th century. And the First World War is part of that narrative that ends in Berlin in 1945. So in confronting that, Germany is asking real questions about how it got to where it is today.
How did the First World War change Germany's view of war and indeed of the military?
Not as much as it should have done, is the short answer. Partly, of course, because the army engineers the revolution from above, so-called. I mean, that in other words, it itself gets rid of the Kaiser. the Kaiser doesn't topple through a democratic process, which is what Woodrow Wilson, the American president, had hoped would happen. It therefore is able, the army, is able to argue after 1919 that it hadn't lost the war on the Western Front because it was still standing on French territory when the war ended. And it was able to argue that the reputation Germany had for military prowess was therefore unbroken. And it's extraordinary in many ways, if you look at the 1920s and 30s, with Germany reduced to an army of 100,000 men by the Treaty of Versailles, still actually seeing war as one of the ways in which it might defend itself. I mean, it really hasn't fully come to terms with the notion that this may be the war to end all wars.
You wrote recently that we in Britain have parochial preoccupations with the mud of the Western Front. What did you mean by that?
Yes, I'm concerned that our approach to this war is still very nationally determined, that we find it very hard to raise our eyes above the British experience, and that means, in most people's understanding, the experience of the Western Front, although British servicemen and women served in many other parts of the world, and of course did many other things than serve in the army. You know, we tend to forget that there were people in the Royal Navy, there were people in Gallipoli, there were people in Mesopotamia, there were people fighting in East Africa. So there isn't one experience of this war, but we've allowed one experience to colour it. And the Western Front that we are concerned with runs only as far as the Somme. Champagne, Verdun, the Vosges, they don't figure. They're not part of our understanding. And there's almost a genuine surprise when you say something staggeringly obvious about the French or German or Austro-Hungarian experience because it's different, or it might be different, or it might be similar. But you know, there isn't an awareness of that. What I would hope is that a 4-year centenary is an opportunity for us to widen our approach. So far, there's no sign of that happening. Put it another way around. 88% of those who put on uniform in the British Armed Forces between 1914 and 1918 came back from this war. In other words, the vast majority survived this war. Of course, it depended on which part of the army, which front you served on. If you were an infantry subaltern on the Western Front, your chances of survival were much less than that. If you were a Royal Flying Corps pilot, even less than that. But the point is, when somebody says, and I hear it said very often, my great-grandfather was one of the lucky ones, he came home. Actually, that's true of most of us alive today. Our great-grandfathers came home because otherwise we wouldn't be here.
British historians argue with each other about the First World War. German historians do the same. But do you have arguments with German historians about the First World War?
Yes, actually, I have fewer arguments. I mean, I think one of the things about German historians and the study of war is because it's been inherently very difficult, it's been much easier for a British historian to study war and to study the First World War than it has been for Germans, because Germans come with more baggage to their own experience of war, and we come at it from outside. It's also been, in a way, liberating for me, because you know, one of my concerns as an academic military historian in Britain is that as we Brits become more monoglot, and particularly my students become more monoglot, they're far less able to engage with what I would call comparative military history. War, you know, is a reciprocal business. It's not just fought by one country. You can't write military history from the perspective, in my understanding, of one country. I mean, you can talk about an army and its relation to its parent society, but you can't talk about battle, campaigns, wars, without engaging with the interaction with the enemy. So it for me is working above all on the First World War. It's incredibly liberating and enlightening and exciting to engage with the literature of not only Germany but also France, but simply to be able to, you know, and it's a truism that I'm sure you're aware of, that it doesn't require much reading in another language to suddenly realize you're in a very different place, and that's vital.
Do you travel often to Germany, and does being there give you a different perspective on German history?
Yes, I go a lot, and I do. So answer yes to both questions. I have the Military History Research Office. I never remember the new German title because it's just been reinvented. But what used to be the Militärgeschichtliches Forschungsamt now in Potsdam, which is part of the Bundeswehr, of course, rather than part of the part of an academic institution rather than a university, is an institution I have a great deal to do with, and I'm on the editorial board of their journal. In terms of the organisation of conferences and so on within the German academic world, they tend to take the principal role. So yes, I go a lot. Yes, I learn a lot in the process.
Thank you, Sir Hew Strachan.
Thank you.